What's up, fellas, and welcome to another episode of Rewriting History with me, the Goob. Today, I was planning on interviewing Max Fomitchev-Zamilov about his research on the Vases. He's not here yet. It's possible he's running late and will join later, but I think it's likely that he won't be able to join us today, unfortunately. So I leave it to you guys. Would you like me to stream anyways? I've put the call-in link in the description, so you're welcome to call in about any topic you want, and I can still cover Dr. Max Fomitchev-Zamilov's recent research paper that was just published on the 16th of this month, so a week ago. I think it's interesting. I think it's worthwhile covering. But I leave it up to you guys if you want me to cover it without him or if I should just cancel this episode and, try and reschedule with him. So I'll give you guys a minute. Again, if you have any other topics that you want to call in and discuss, the link's in the description and you're welcome to do so. But it seems like it's going to be just me today. So okay. Well, Slav wants to hear about the paper, so I think I'll talk about it a little bit. All right. So the vases back in 2017, the OG thin vase was scanned, which had remarkable precision, and for several years that was the only vase that we had, and myself and many others believed this to be evidence for ancient high technology. Petrie found these vases in like 1883 in the tens of thousands. In 2023, that scan was released, and then a little bit later, more scans on more private vessels were done, showing similar levels of precision. Again, furthering this idea of ancient high technology. And then in 2024, Olga, with Scientists Against Myths, recreated a couple of vases with handheld tools. There's a little controversy because she also used a rotary table to mark high spots, but they were created with handheld tools, and they didn't match these private collection vases, but they were fairly similar in precision to the later scanned, just earlier this year, the Petrie vessels. So a few dozen vessels from the Petrie Museum were scanned. And this is where it starts to get confusing and complicated, because initially the outside of the vessels were scanned, and they very clearly did not show this level of high precision, this, high-tech, modern technology, lathe type precision. And they really didn't seem to show any obvious signs of rotational technology at all, but they were still very impressive. A little bit later, Max went back and scanned these vessels again, getting a look at the interior of these vessels. And that's where it gets even more confusing, because the interior of these vessels showed very clear evidence of rotational technology. It's very obvious that these were not just made with hand tools, but it still wasn't quite the high technology level that is found in the private collections. And so Max's conclusion from this, and I believe it's an accurate conclusion, is that the OG vase, the one that you can shine a flashlight through because it's so thin and so perfect, so shiny, that's a modern forgery. It seems pretty conclusive that a lot of the vases inside of private collections that are reportedly predynastic vases are actually modern creations from the 18 and 1900s. And Max goes over his methods here in this paper to describe how he scanned these things, these hard stone vessels. You can see, the legitimate ancient vessels are not nearly as shiny as the OG spinner vase. They look like they're 6,000 years old. And if I can get down, there's some interesting things doubts about authenticity, which those doubts seem to have been correct. The methods. So he goes through, he scans these things and measures the circularity. He measures how well those circles line up with each other. So here you see the circle fit that he's calculating for each slice of these vases. What did I just do? A lot of math in here, right? And then the concentricity. So how well are those circles stacked upon each other? And you can see the inner surface and the outer surface here, the outer surface being pretty concentric, the inner surface being less concentric, but the circularity of the inner is pretty good. Let me get down to the interesting stuff here. He scanned modern vases that are created in Egypt today with hand tools. He scanned modern vases from lathes, and he scanned the private collection and the Petrie collection. So there's 4 different data sets to work with to compare to each other. And you see all of that down here. And what he's done is the features are distinct between all 4 of these classes: the private collection, the Petrie museums, and the modern collection and the handmade modern collection. The handmade in red here, you can see that their precision is lower than a lot of the, is this measuring the precision, or I think this is actually measuring, yeah, okay. So this is still on the precision. Later he gets into comparative analysis. You can see, you know, the machined ones from private collections, very, very precise. Then you have pretty decent precision within the legitimate ancient not handcrafted, but the legitimate ancient vessels. And then the handcrafted vessels are a lot less precise, generally speaking. And here's a better visualization. So here we have in microns, you know, the precision of these private collection vessels, the inner quality on the bottom, the outer quality on the outside. These are totally distinct from the handmade modern vessels and the ancient vessels. The ancient vessels and the handmade look very similar here. You can look at this graph and you can go, they're the same thing. They were made in the same ways. This proves that the ancient vessels were made with handmade methods. It gets more complicated though, because as we continue this analysis, you start to see these separate. So the circularity of the predynastic vases on the inner surface on the left, the inner surface on the right, the outer surface on the left. So on the outside, the predynastic vessels are a lot less circular, right? You see the circularity coming all the way out to 400 or 500 microns. But the concentricity of the outside, so how well does it maintain its form? So each, if you slice it, that circularity is that bottom part of this graph. And the circularity is not that precise in the ancient vessels. Meanwhile, the concentricity, meaning the overall shape of the vessel, how well are those stacked? The concentricity is actually greater than the modern handmade vessels, and then vice versa on the inner surface. On the inner surface, you have concentricity that rivals almost, I said this all backwards, switch concentricity and circularity, but you have circularity, now I'm saying it correctly, that rivals almost the machined vessels from modern collections. Meanwhile, you know, the handmade vessels show very little circularity and pretty good concentricity. So it's flipped. So there's, even though the overall precision is very similar, the specifics of the precision show a clear distinction between modern handmade vessels and the ancient predynastic vessels. Let's see. I wasn't really prepared to talk about this on my own. I had a lot of questions I wanted to ask Max to get clarity. I'm trying to find. Basically, what this means is that the modern vessels, when you look at the inside, again, show very clear signs of rotational technology. The circularity of each individual slice is well beyond what's achievable with hand tools. You can see, compare them to the modern handcrafted Egyptian vessels that are made with hand tools today. They don't achieve nearly the same level of circularity. So, what appears to be going on is that these vessels were on some type of rig, whether you want to call it a lathe or something else, but a rotational device in which you could set down a grinding disc or some type of, stone so that you mix it with sand and then rotate both the vase. And as far as I can tell, it would also require rotation of the tool that you're inserting down, the grinding disc that you're inserting down as well, to rotate against each other. And you have pretty decent precision, pretty decent control over this rotational process. So these rotations are happening on a tight axis. This is not happening with like handheld tools being rotated in a hand. This is in some type of jig with fixed settings to allow that rotation to happen at a fixed spot and grind away at this vase and create these beautiful circles. But then to, go further down into the vase and grind again, that tool has to be reset, repositioned, and they don't have a precise way of doing this like we do with computers today with modern lathes. So by hand, they're resetting this jig, readjusting that tool, and restarting the grinding. So each circle is very circular, but each circle is not perfectly stacked upon the next circle, if that makes sense. Now, this poses, Max seems to, go case closed. I think he actually used those words exactly, case closed, like it's not high technology. And so this does align with the technology that we would expect to see in Egypt 6,000 years ago. And that's my biggest disagreement with Max, because the potter's wheel doesn't appear for about 1,500 years after this. We see the soft stone vessels that are mass produced in Khufu's time, 2,000, again, 1,500, 2,000 years after this, with significantly lower quality, with no evidence of rotational technology, obviously handmade. And within the pre-dynastic civilization, 6,500 years ago, we don't see any other evidence of rotational technology. We have pottery from that era. The pottery shows no evidence of anything like a potter's wheel. Their other artifacts don't show evidence of anything like a lathe. And so how do we have tens of thousands of vases being produced in pre-dynastic Egypt? And one other point that I wanted to make about the pre-dynastic vases is on the outside, there is a very subtle but very consistent in every single vase that was scanned from the Petrie Museum, oblongity. I don't know the exact word that's supposed to, but an oblong shape on the outside of these vases. So on opposing sides, you have by just a few thousandths of an inch, it's slightly wider on two sides, and then rotate 90 degrees, it's slightly more narrow on those two sides. And this is consistent across every vase that's been scanned in the Petrie Museum. So while I said there was no obvious evidence of rotational technology on the outside, it seems pretty clear they were using it. And the fact that you have that consistent oblong nature on every vessel scanned, to me, would indicate that these vessels, at the very least, were all created using the same techniques, if not the very same machine. That consistency across every vessel, to me, suggests that these were all made in an industrial process with the same machine, that same rotational technology. And then going back to the case being closed, that let me show one of Max's posts here. one of his recent posts where he hypothesizes about this industrial nature of the production. If I can find it here, right? So pull it up on my screen. Here we have, Max is proposing that they essentially had Roman level technology, and this is pure speculation, right? But he also seems to believe that these vases are a product of an industrial mass production process, which I strongly agree with. And this is like end of the Roman era level technology. This might not be high tech by today's standards, but this is thousands of years removed from what we believe that pre-dynastic Egyptians had 6,500 years ago. And it sure seems that something along these lines, it might not have been exactly like this, but something along these lines was in fact involved in an industrial process making these vases and mass producing these vases. I don't know how to reconcile a proto-civilization like pre-dynastic Egypt mass producing vases using this type of technology while not applying it to any other part of their civilization. On top of that, you have not Menkaure, but Djoser. You have Djoser collecting these tens of thousands of vases from pre-dynastic times, hiding them underneath his pyramid, and then you have the restarting of much lower quality vases happening immediately after that, the mass production of lower quality vases. You also have, in the initial phases of these vases showing up in the archaeological record, you have them showing up before. This is obviously pre-dynastic Egypt, so there's no singular king of Egypt at this time. Dynasties hadn't started, but there's still relatively small tribal groups. They don't have broad power structures with a singular leader ruling over, the entire Giza plateau or anything like that. So these vases appear, and they appear amongst the poor, amongst the rich. They appear evenly amongst everyone. Shortly after they appear, you start to see consolidation of these vases amongst the wealthy. And I would actually suggest that it's possible that the accumulation of these vases actually dictated who became the wealthy, who became the powerful, and who had control over, Egypt. So you see the consolidation of power occurring after these vases occur, which again seem to be product of Roman era technology. And eventually you have dynastic Egypt form as these vases become pretty much exclusively concentrated amongst the ruling class. And then you have Djoser hiding them all away and production restarting at a much lower quality. So this idea that Ben van Kerkwijk puts out that these vases could be a found set of artifacts, very similarly to how we found these artifacts under Djoser's pyramid after sitting there for 4,500 years, even though these aren't a product of modern high technology, modern standards of high technology, there's still absolutely high technology for the time, high technology that we don't see in that civilization. And I have to wonder if it's still entirely possible that Ben van Kerkwijk was right with his initial idea that these were found by the pre-dynastic Egyptians, which is why we find them amongst the poor and the rich alike. And then they were recognized as something remarkable because they are remarkable, even if they're not made with space lasers. And that actually drove the concentration of power, that drove the dynastic Egypt to form. And then as dynastic Egypt is, becoming more impressive and they're starting to create their own very impressive works, Djoser decides perhaps there was too much turmoil, too much fighting over these vases. This is all speculation. But if there are these extremely valuable objects that can't be reproduced, perhaps he thought it would be better to just do away with them all, bury them all. Or perhaps it was a pride thing. They couldn't recreate them to the same standards. So they do away with these things from this previous civilization that they couldn't quite recreate, and they start creating their own art. I don't know, but those all seem entirely possible to me. Yeah, there was a pre-Egyptian civilization in Egyptian lands that did seem to like to dig underground before dynastic Egypt is formed. Um, yeah, I mean, someone had the lathe. Either someone in pre-dynastic Egypt or someone before pre-dynastic Egypt. When we don't see any evidence of lathes outside of these vases, it does make me wonder, was it someone before? And I'm not even addressing all of the other objects in Egypt that are remarkable, like the sarcophagi, like all of the megaliths on Elephantine Island. Could some or all of those also be a product of this same civilization? It gets a little bit confusing when I try and ascribe those things to these pre-dynastic civilization as well. One of my first videos on this channel is going over what's that guy's name? The 19th dynasty ruler, one of the most famous kings. I'm blanking on it right now, but I analyze his statues, and I find a statue that has, again, these signs of high technology, exquisite polishing, exquisite shaping, the ridges that are just seamlessly perfect. But it has hand chiseled hieroglyphics on it. And I highlight how those hand chiseled hieroglyphics almost have to be a product of the original production. Like they weren't written on later. I also highlight how the similarity in the faces across all of these statues doesn't make sense. We're looking at large spans of time here in Egypt, right? Very large spans of time. And the idea that these later kings found all of these statues and happened to find each king just happened to find statues that had the same face, and they wrote their name on those statues. And then the next king came along and found more statues with another face and wrote, like, it doesn't really add up. So these later dynasties very clearly were able to produce these exquisite stonework statues, in my opinion. And you even have very early exquisite statues like the triads of Menkore, which are some of the finest statues in all of Egypt. Menkore being, again, fourth dynasty, so 4,500 years ago. So the exquisite stonework spans thousands of years in Egypt, and at least some of it is, in my opinion, undoubtedly from those time periods. It's not from an earlier time period. But could some of this stonework be? Again, people were living in Egypt, people were living on the Giza Plateau continuously, but we don't see real development on the Giza Plateau until the fourth dynasty, until the Great Pyramids. And so it seems unlikely to me that if the pre-dynastics wouldn't have occupied these grand structures and revered these massive megaliths, because they did seem to revere the vases, right? So if the vases and these massive megaliths both existed at the same time, why did they pay no attention to the massive megaliths? There's issues with that idea, I think, but the vases are undeniably pre-dynastic. The vases are undeniably evidence of rotational technology, and we don't see that rotational technology exist again in Egypt for thousands of years afterwards. So if you guys have any theories, feel free to call in and share them, or share them in chat. But in my opinion, there's still a lot of questions to be answered with these vases and Egypt in general. I really hope that museums take Max up on his offer, because I do believe he's freely offered his software to these museums so that they can put their vases through the same analysis that Max has, because a lot of the vases in museums come from private collections. A lot of the vases in museums are highly polished, like the OG vase that seems to be a product of modern technology. And I wonder if some of these vases are actually pre-dynastic vases that, in order to fetch a higher price on the black market, were put on a lathe and were polished on a modern lathe to make them nice and shiny again. And through Max's analysis, as I was describing how the inside of these pre-dynastic vases have high circularity but low concentricity, which is very different from what we see on modern lathe production today, and also very different from what we see on hand production, I think we could actually determine with reasonable certainty if that is what we're looking at in these museum vases. They could scan them. They could determine if they're modern productions. They could determine if they're legitimate ancient artifacts. And they should theoretically even be able to determine if they're legitimate ancient artifacts that were then polished up on a high-speed modern lathe. So I really hope that museums do take them up on this offer. I'm highly doubtful that they will, because these vases are, especially with all the attention they've gotten over recent years, have become tourist attractions. And they probably don't want to remove a bunch of fake artifacts or have to put disclaimers on their artifacts that, yeah, this is likely ancient, but it's also partly modern. And so I don't think we're going to see museums do that, but I'm hopeful they do. Yeah, but I believe, again, that we don't see that until about the Fourth Dynasty. And that's about 1,500 years after these pre-dynastic vases. So I am aware of them. Yeah, right. And your next comment just said that. So about 1,500 years later, or, depending on exactly where you place these vases, at least 1,000 years later. And yes, 1,000 years before the potter's wheel, and the potter's wheel shows up before proper lathes. I would suggest that the level of precision we see on the insides of these vases is indicative of something well beyond the tornet and well beyond a potter's wheel. Like, these have pretty high levels of precision, like the rotational aspects. Again, in my opinion, and this might not be correct, but in my opinion, to achieve this, you need rotation of the vase itself, and you need rotation of whatever is cutting or grinding inside. So you need dual rotation, and both of those need to be fixed and centered. And to achieve the level of circularity that we're seeing, they have to be pretty darn well fixed and centered. Like, I'm not sure if just a wooden jig accomplishes that. It's in a bit of a gray area for me. I don't know if this would require metal tools. It might be entirely feasible through wood, but this is a complex system that we're dealing with. This is not. No, it doesn't, but it does take a special kind of someone to have rotational tools and to apply them exclusively to vases and to no other aspect of your civilization. So, but yeah, the level of precision is beyond something that's like a hand jig. Like, this isn't just a tool being set in a chunk of wood and rotated with hands. Like, this is pretty solid levels of rotation. So, okay. So if you have a vase, right? So you take the vase, you core it out first with a copper tooth drill. And then you drop down in your grinding disc to open it up, to widen that insert. If you only had rotation of the vase itself, you wouldn't, in my opinion, and if there's a good answer to this, correct me, but you would if you're using those mace heads or grinding discs that are found in Egypt, um, I think Max has some pictures. Let me get some visuals up on the screen so this makes a little bit more sense. Here we go. He's got some good images here. Let's see. So here we go. These mace heads here, right? Let's assume that's a grinding disc, which I'm not fully sold that those were the tools being used for this. But let's assume you're using that as a grinding disc. So you drop that down into the vase, and then you're only rotating the vase. You would grind away one side of that grinding disc, and I don't believe you'd end up with a very circular shape. And if you were only rotating the tool itself, you would grind into one side of the vase and you wouldn't, again, achieve that circular shape. So I believe you need rotation of the vase and of the grinding disc in order to actually achieve that circularity to the degree that we see it. There would also, I would imagine, have to be maybe not. I won't even get into that. But yeah. Right, but they allegedly only have copper. Copper would not be adequate for this, I don't believe. So you're either talking about an L-shaped stone tool, which could be achieved by, sticking something like this onto a stick, right? Um, or you're having, iron or steel involved. Um, and getting into the minute details of these scans, what we see from, because that is how these modern handmade vases are made. They use a steel L-shaped tool inside the vase, and they rotate the vase and hollow out the inside of the vase with that L-shaped steel tool. Those interiors look very distinctly different from these interiors. And I don't know if that explains these vases. To me, how these vases are made is still a mystery. Um, but if we are looking at these mace heads, if we're going with the idea that these mace heads here, these types of tools here are the grinding bits, I would think you would have to have dual rotation in order to make these work, because you have circular grinding discs. If again you just grind away one side of that, I would think you'd have to have dual rotation. So yeah, that's where we're left here, is that we still don't know how these vases were made. We do know now that rotational technology was involved. We know that we don't see any other evidence for 1,500 years. We know that we don't see any other evidence within the pre-dynastic civilization itself. I don't know entirely what to think. But Ben's idea that these were found objects from an untold time uh, seems reasonable to me still, and it fits with my greater view of the ancient world. I was talking last episode about how this idea that lost civilizations are this unthinkable thing is entirely ridiculous. We have pretty decent evidence of, examples of technology going back way further than we think. We have evidence of humanity going back hundreds of thousands of years. We just got recent evidence of copper production 11,000 years ago in Turkey. Thousands of years before, I think prior to that, around 7,000 years old was like the oldest widely accepted copper production. Yeah, Yeah, and maybe that's exactly how it was done. You still, like I said, it still requires an actual machine to do this. It still is beyond like just handheld or even a jig with hand rotation, in my opinion. The comparing similar things, comparing scientists against myths, comparing the modern handmade vases. Um, we're seeing something beyond that in these pre-dynastic vases. We're seeing evidence, in my opinion, of an industrial process. Again, that consistent oblong nature on the exterior of the vases, how each and every single vase was just consistently a few thousandths of an inch oblong on each side, to me indicates that like the same machine was responsible for the production of all of those things. It was an industrial process. Yeah, and I that's extremely possible. The only issue I have with that is why do we see it only on vases? Right? If the pre-dynastic Egyptians had lathe technology and it was lost by the time dynastic Egypt came around, that's entirely plausible. That's a very likely scenario. What makes it unlikely is that we don't see the lathe technology applied to anything other than vases. That's a major hiccup in that idea, in my opinion. But yes, technology is lost all the time. With the Antikythera mechanism, we had extreme engineering in the Greek era, and then that was lost by the time Rome had come about. So technology does get lost all the time. Totally believable. What's not believable is if they had that, why only use it for vases? So yeah, predictions. Uh, the only other thing you would use it for wood, maybe. I mean, maybe it is as simple as that. Maybe it is as simple as that. That is a possibility. That is a possibility. I still, and I guess if they have the technology and they're using it for wooden vases, um, it could explain the high volume of vases and the wood is just gone. That's possible. Predictions for 2026. I think things will keep getting older. I think that I hope this isn't so much a prediction as just a hope. I hope that people wake up to the level of corruption within archaeology and any history related field of study, that people wake up to the contempt that academics and archaeologists hold for the general public. And I hope that there is a divestment. I talked about how people wait for the confirmed sources. I use political examples just because they're good analogies, but like we just got confirmation of massive fraud in the 2016 election. And people are now sharing that widely, going, look, they admitted it. It's confirmed there was fraud. Or the DEI stuff, the white discrimination. They're like, look, this really is happening, and it's like, yeah, no shit, that stuff is happening. You shouldn't have to wait for official sources to tell you these things. And the same thing happens in archaeology. People, we can look at the information provided to us and see so clearly that it doesn't add up, that the official narrative is just bullshit, but there's this hesitancy to actually like take a firm stance and disagree with it until an official source goes, yeah, it actually is bullshit. So not so much a prediction, but I do hope there's a divestment from the gatekeepers, from the experts and the officials, and I hope that we see more alternate history people like Raoul from Pillars of the Past taking it upon themselves to go do this research themselves to put the pieces together and not concern themselves with the blatant lies that come from the official sources. So since I wasn't able to interview Max today, that's really all I've got. Hopefully the interview can happen in the future, because I really do want to hear his opinions on these things. He's had more interaction than almost anyone in the world with both the vases themselves and the scans and the analysis. I mean, he's the one who did the analysis and the scans. So I would love to get his opinions on these things. I think that he feels a little bit done with it all. He feels a little bit over with it all, because it wasn't the space laser level technology that he and I and many of us were hoping for. But I think there is still a lot to be figured out. I think there is still a lot of value in studying these vases. I hope that even if he's done directly interacting with these things, that other people take up his mantle, that more scans are continually happening, both in the private sector, the museum world, etc. So thanks for joining me, fellas, and I'll catch you next time. Peace out.